Dear brothers and sisters, through the Spirit of St. Augustine, this is a homily for 14th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Year B. Power at its best in weakness. In order to come up with this theme, I was inspired by what St. Paul says in today's second reading, that is, the power of God's grace that made Paul to be strong even during his weakest moments. Actually, this is echoed in the first reading and in the Gospel of today too. Each one of us has a weakness or limitations. But how can one tap the power of grace during these weakest moments? What does our weaknesses remind us to do as Christians today? Lastly, when and how can we live a healthy spiritual Christian life despite the weaknesses or limitations that we encounter today? To begin with, St. Paul reminds us in the second reading something very important, that is the weaknesses of a human person. At times we ignore it or we don't know what it is at all. Anyway, that is a topic for another day, but now let us look at the weakness as explained by St. Paul, which he likens to a thorn in his flesh. But why does Paul bring up this discussion? Because the Corinthians were questioning his discipleship. And that is why he explains clearly to them in the passage of today that even though he received a revelation in an extraordinary way, he still has some thorns in his flesh as weaknesses and limitations. Moreover, the main purpose for that is that these weaknesses shapes his Christian life as an apostle of Christ. On the other hand, we too have these weaknesses or limitations in us as human beings. Therefore, they are supposed to panel beat us so as to remain on the path of salvation and depend on God's help. In addition to that, in the first reading during exile's period, we see Prophet Ezekiel as a human person with weaknesses or limitations, and that is why the Spirit of God entered him and he stood up to listen to God's message. Here, we see the power of the Spirit of God at its best during Ezekiel's weakest moment. Indeed, the Spirit fortified him and he listened to the message of God. On the other hand, the people of Israel who were disobeying God's commands every now and then, God sends Prophet Ezekiel with a message of hope to them. In this regard, the power of God's grace at its best to the people of Israel who are weak and discouraged by life events. Turning to the Gospel of today, we find more or less similar reactions showing human limitations or weaknesses. This is to say that Jesus goes back to his village, Nazareth, where he grew up even though he was born at Bethlehem. The inhabitants of Nazareth do not receive the message of salvation simply because they saw him through the eyes of limitations and his weaknesses. For instance, they wondered where he got all that wisdom to teach, and yet they knew that he was the son of Mary, a mere carpenter, and they knew his brothers and sisters who were with them. So, where did he get all the powers to heal and speak with wisdom? As a matter of fact, this shows that his countrymen were blocked by human limitations, and that is why they did not benefit from his message. Here we see again the power of God's grace at its best in human weaknesses, although the people from Nazareth did not accept one of their own. They lacked faith. As a Christian today, what should one do to cope up with these weaknesses? There are 2 steps. 1, accept. 2, collaborate horizontally with God and vertically with one another. To accept one's weakness is a first step to meet God's grace. For example, St. Paul says, I am happy with my weaknesses and with insults, hardships, persecutions, and the agonies I go through for Christ's sake. This shows acceptance. Even though at first Paul prayed that such weaknesses may be removed from him, but the Lord assured him of his help through grace. Indeed, the power of his grace is best for Paul as well as for us today. Don't pray for weaknesses to be removed from you, but pray for God's help through the power of his grace that is best in our weakest moments. Another way to cope up with our weaknesses is through collaboration. First and foremost, this means that solidarity with one another as well as with God. For example, 3 people who want to pluck a fruit from a tree, that is a blind person who can walk, a lame person who can see, and a deaf person who sees and walks. The best possibility could be that a lame person climbs on the back of the blind man, of course with the help of a deaf person who walks and sees. Then the lame person will see and pluck the fruits, while the deaf person will collect them into a basket because he can see and walk. In summary, they will all have fruits finally, thanks to the collaboration. Our weaknesses compel us to collaborate with the grace of God and with others. The power of collaboration and the grace of God is the best during our weakest moments. To conclude, we are invited on this Sunday to identify our weaknesses, to accept them, and allow the power of God's grace to operate best during our weakest moments. Weaknesses or limitations remind us to turn to God for help always. His grace and His Spirit are the power of God at its best in our weaknesses. Amen. Have a blessed Sunday.